am I actually having to talk about this? Apparently so. So, Doctor Who Twitter just did its bi-weekly thing of exploding into the heinous name-calling and degrading debate that it politely terms as discourse, which is more street riots than it is a rational discussion about a TV show. All of this started because one YouTuber had the audacity to talk about how much he loves the 10th Doctor story, Human Nature, and the Family of Blood. I really didn't want to discuss this, largely because it involves racial issues, and white people weighing into this debate were told that the representation of racism on screen was nothing to do with them because they were white. The funniest part of this is that most people saying this were also, unsurprisingly, white people. Family of Blood Two-Parter is one of the best regarded stories, not just of this era, but in any era of this show. There's an argument to be made that it is the best story ever, and in fact, Full Fat Videos made a brilliant case for that in a video you should absolutely check out. This doesn't seem to be on the table here, however. No, instead, the whole debate is about whether the story is problematic and whether Joan Redfern is a horrible, bigoted person, and whether the Doctor is callous and minimalises Martha's suffering by choosing a time period where she might be subject to racial abuse. Now, that last point is absolutely stupid because A, the Doctor doesn't choose the location of 1913 England, the TARDIS does, so that argument is totally null and void. And B, the Doctor's entire character arc in Series 3 is all about him consistently minimising Martha and simply using her to cover his loss of Rose, mistreating her, and essentially using her to stroke his own ego. So even if he did choose a location, it wouldn't exactly be out of character. The Doctor isn't even the hero of this story, in fact, prepared to be very disturbed by some of his actions. The real hero here is Martha Jones. The other issues up for debate are more warranting of discussion, but I personally have a very definitive answer. And to me, as much as I almost fear saying it, no, there is nothing problematic about this story, and also, more controversially, no. Joan Redfern is not a completely horrible person, and that is kind of the point. One of the things that I really love about this story is how the society is depicted. The perfect blend of idyllic countryside and a romanticised small town English life in a simpler age that is a smokescreen for a deep cover of racism, sexism, and classism. Yeah, all the debate about the story always centres on the racism, but I would argue that those other two themes are every bit as obvious, if not more so. It actually bothers to depict life as close as it was without crossing any lines that couldn't be shown on children's TV, such as the sexual harassment that Martha would almost certainly have faced in an establishment like the one that she's working in. And all of the side cast actually behave, think, and speak like actual people of the age. I am so tired of seeing anachronistically progressive characters in historical programs. In order to make the characters likable, your main characters in everything are opposed to racism, opposed to homophobia, and the female characters are anachronistically emancipated, often espousing feminist ideals many years before they would even be conceived. I hate to say it, but if you were going to do an accurate representation of characters like the Three Musketeers, they would all hold bigoted, regressive opinions by today's standards. This shouldn't be shocking. The story is set in 17th century France. The BBC's Musketeers diversifies the cast and makes them all very liberal in their outlook as a deliberate way to endear them to a modern audience. And don't get me wrong, I adore the BBC's take on the Musketeers, but it always has to be viewed as a deliberate modernisation of the source material. If you are writing a Doctor Who story and it's historical, you should be aiming to accurately represent the time and society that you are writing for. Every time a show set deep in the past does an LGBT storyline, all of the main characters support the gay characters and are depicted as flowers amongst the thorns, the few sane and progressive voices in a world of barbarians. It's just not an accurate depiction of the time period. Human Nature shows Martha receiving consistent and low-level racist abuse in the form of snide remarks and demeaning behaviour, as well as being consistently put down for her gender and social class, made to sit outside of the pub instead of inside with the men, and treated with contempt and snobbery because she is just a servant. So many Doctor Who stories would just move past this. We go to the past with our person of colour companion like Martha or Bill or Ryan or Yaz, and most of the time it will never get brought up. Series 3 consistently has Martha thrust into racist environments and societies and never deals with it, whether it's a London with slavery or America in 1930, just 4 years after the KKK brazenly marched around Washington and at the height of their membership, and it's not even brought up. Now, I've got no complaints about this. I don't want every Doctor Who historical to get totally preoccupied with deconstructing the prejudices of the time period, but every once in a while, I feel like it's the show's moral obligation to do a story like this. Now, this is what I wanted to say, and yeah, I get that it's controversial, but Joan Redfern is not a terrible human being. Both the Doctor's human persona, John Smith, and Joan Redfern are fantastic examples of characters who are portrayed as fundamentally good people for their time, but who both hold some of the most fundamental prejudices and are informed by those prejudices and by the society that they've been brought up in. The words that I've seen floating around to describe Joan are, and I'm quoting here, an utter garbage human being, and some saying that it is utterly disgusting that the show depicts the Doctor falling in love with a horrible racist. Now, first of all, the Doctor doesn't fall in love with Joan, John Smith does. And that is an important distinction. But also, historical context is important. Joan and John's views are very moderate by the time period they're in. And Joan has literally one scene demonstrating her prejudice to Martha, and when Martha gets an amazing scene demonstrating her knowledge about the bones of the hand, she immediately accepts her and shows no prejudice towards her again. Joan is actually quite forward thinking in many other areas. She sees through the folly of the glorification of war, having lost a husband to violence, and opposes the corporal punishment she sees at the school, something that John Smith does not, casually allowing one of his students to take a beating. A criticism that is noticeably missing from the Joan is a horrible racist argument is that John Smith also shows the exact same prejudices. With his patronising, this is what we call a story, showing that even in his fictional life, his upbringings in 1870s or 1880s Nottingham has installed the same beliefs in him as Joan holds. Essentially, every character in this story shows bigotry, with the exception of Jenny, who is a servant and a woman, so she can sympathise with what it is like to be treated poorly by the snobbish gentry who attend this school. And of course, Timothy Latimer, who's just a legend, who even calls out the colonialist and imperialist attitudes of his superiors. This does not make the head teacher, the veteran on the door, Jeremy Baines or Hutchinson bad people. They are all prejudiced, and the script is very forthcoming in its belief that prejudice is wrong. But these people are still good people for the time that they live in. There is this amazing scene that really encapsulates this. When Hutchinson uses Martha's race to humiliate her for a joke in front of his friend Baines, and Martha gets angry about it, demonstrating an impatience towards the regressive time period, before, after Jenny's comment that in a few years like that, boys like that will be running the country, realizing that in spite of how they treat her, in a few years, a lot of these children will be dead, cut down on foreign fields, led under the delusion of king and country donkeys till they lie dead in the mud, and that they are still good people whose deaths would and will be tragic. Most of the people who died in the First World War, and probably the Second World War, the people who we honour every year for selflessness and sacrifice, held views that would not be seen as acceptable today. This story's main theme is the folly of Britain heading into war and the notions of the war that is glorified. That this is perfectly represented metaphorically by the boys' school that teaches them that dying in war is glorious. Acknowledging that the men who were sent to their deaths were not perfect and were products of their time is a really intriguing message, and it's something that is worth acknowledging. You can't just apply your black and white morality to the shades of grey in the nuances of the past. I feel like so many of these people who hate the racial elements in this story believe that if they were born in the Middle Ages or in the deep South after the American Civil War, they would still believe the exact same things. They would be a bastion of morality and progressive viewpoints. I hate to shatter the illusion, but you absolutely would not be. You would be bigoted, a product of the society that you grew up in. Not that it's impossible to escape your conditioning, but because people are not naturally good or evil, everyone is a product of their upbringing. I'm not saying this is the be all and end all of stories dealing with race. I actually believe that Thin Ice provides the perfect total opposite to this. A vile and virulent racist who you will happily see punched by Capaldi, as he's just such a repugnant and prejudiced human being, as well as discussing issues such as historical whitewashing and slavery. One of the most infuriating parts in this debate was someone being told that their whiteness invalidated their opinion because they said that they believed this was a more interesting depiction of racism than the one in Rosa. I actually agree with the latter opinion, not that whiteness invalidated his opinion on a Doctor Who story. Rosa is still a good story and one of the better ones in this current era, but it has a really simple but effective message. Racism bad, and it seems odd to me that in the 13th Doctor's confrontation with Krasko, she never challenges his prejudice. She just tells him that his plan is wrong because he shouldn't screw with history, and essentially tells him to go and be a space racist somewhere else. However, it should be noted that the genuine historical story beneath the weird Krasko angle fantastically depicts a truly racist society. Segregation, Emmett Till, and lynchings. It doesn't shy away from its message. All three of these stories depict racist societies really well, with different levels of resistance from the companions, different levels of challenging the views of racists by the doctors, and take from slightly different angles. It's perfectly fine to like or dislike any of them, and to have feelings about which handles the racialized element better. But there is no excuse for some of the behaviour I've seen over the past day or two. We need to understand the nuances of the past, especially in historical stories. These characters are not bad people just because they hold outdated views. Their views are horrible, and people who hold them today are very much horrible. But people in the future will look back on us and our prejudices with the same sneering judgmentality. The show is right to depict historical characters in the way they actually would have been without sugarcoating it for modern audiences. The show is right to illustrate the nuances of the past, and if you're going to approach it through a black and white lens, then you're going to forever think that every single person born before you was a horrible, horrible person. I will defend this to the bitter end. Not only was Paul Cornell right to characterise his characters this way, but he was right to characterise them as fundamentally good people who still hold the prejudices of the time.